Okay, we are continuing on section 7.4 of the Savitch C++, which is multidimensional arrays. So we have been working on a single array, meaning that we're going to have a list of things, and it was only one. We didn't have a two-dimensional, so it was just the regular one we were doing. Now we're talking about two-dimensional. So the way that we're going to be defining a two-dimensional, we're going to put two brackets next to each other. The first one for the rows, the second one for the columns. In C++, you can have three-dimensional, four-dimensional, and so on. So you can have as many as you want. It doesn't really matter to C++. So this one is going to create 30 rows, 100 columns. But we have to be careful, just like regular arrays that we were using, index starts from 0, 1 less than what we are putting right here. So if the first one is 30, I'm going to have 0 to 29. If the second one is 100, I'm going to have 0 to 99. So the first one is my rows. The second one, the first one is my rows. The second one is my columns. So it would create a two-dimensional array. If I want to visualize it, it's going to be something like this, that my columns are on the top, my rows are on the side. So with this, we're going to go through each row from starting with 0, and we're going to go to all the columns, the normal way of doing it. Then we go to the next row and we do the same thing. So the first number in a bracket is my row, comma, my column. So row, column. So this would be 1, 0. My row is 1, my column is 0. This one is 0, 99. My row is 0, my column is 99. If I go all the way down here, my row has changed from 0 to 29. So it's 29, column 0, 29, column 1, all the way down to 29, column 99. So when we were working with one-dimensional array, the typical way of doing it was a for loop, start with 0 and before the array size. So if I had 10, it would be 0 to 9. If I had 100, it would be 0 to 99. Would traverse through the whole array. Now, when we're switching to two-dimensional array, then we're going to need two loops. One goes through the rows and one goes through the columns. So the first one is going to go through rows, but every time I'm in one row, I'm going to go through all the columns. So I'm going to go to row 0. I'm going to go in the example that we had, column 0 to 99. Then I come back here, I'll go to the next row. So in this case, every time I finish the second or inner for loop, I'm going to the next row. In the inner one, I'm going through the columns. So when we were doing a one-dimensional array, we had nothing inside the brackets. So typically, if you are passing one element, you put a number in there. But if you're passing the whole array, you don't put anything in there. Even if you put something in there, a compiler is going to ignore it. It's not a good practice to put a number in there. So you leave it empty, and then we pass the size with it. Now, when we are going to be calling the multidimensional, we're just going to focus on two-dimensional for now. The very first one is going to be empty. The second one is going to have its size in it. And then we pass the size of what was expected here. So in our case, we had 30, 100. So this would be 30 that's passing in. So in reality, how the C++ does it for a two-dimensional is looking at an array of size 30 of data type of 100 characters. So it's array of arrays. That's the way it's working. We're going to go quickly over this example, and we work on this as we progress in the class, either in homework assignment, lab, or starting the final project. We're going to be playing with something similar to this. So if I have a two-dimensional array, or I have a list of students with quizzes, so we have 4 students and 3 quizzes. Student 1, 2, 3, 4, quiz 1, 2, 3. So this is the way we're going to create the gradebook. So in this program, we want to do the average score. We want to do the average for the quizzes. So for every test, every quiz that you do, I want to see what is the average grade for it. And on the other side, I want to know what's the average grade for each student. So remember that we talked about if I want to go to a normal two-dimensional array, I'm going to need 2 for loops. So we are going to be looking at 2 constant variable, one for our rows, one for our column. We're calling them some meaningful names, so we know what it is. And what else do we want to know about this? So we can start with one of these and get to the other 2. This is the display one. The display one is going through 2 for loops, as we talked about. So we're going to have one for loop that goes through. We're going to have one for loop that goes through rows, and we're going to have another for loop that goes through the column. Remember, every time we go through the rows, that is for each student. So for each row, we're going to go to each student. The inner one is for columns. So the inner one is going through the columns. Now, let's go over this a little more detail. So we have our constant number of students and the number of quizzes. We're going to declare our array as two-dimensional array. We're going to put this one here. I'm going to put this one here. So the number of rows are 4. We're getting it from here. The number of last index that we can have for rows is 3. The number of columns are number of quizzes, which is 3. And the last index that we can have is going to be 2. We want to be sure you don't fall off of it. So if we look at it, this is the way it's going to be the gradebook. 0, 0 is here, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, and all the way down here to 3, 2, which is the last one. So we have to be careful that we do not have grade 4 and 3. If I use this number here, and I use this number here, and I put it here, it is actually outside of my table. And remember, C++ does not check for that. So if I assign something here, it's going to go into memory, and it's going to change some variables. I'd be lucky if it crashes. But most likely it's going to let's say I have a count and my count all of a sudden becomes something else. So we got to be careful that we don't go outside of our range. So for every row is going to be a student. For every column is going to be the quizzes. So if I want to do, so the typical way of going through the two-dimensional array that I'm used to is I go through the rows and I go through the columns. So your book wants to use some meaningful name. So instead of rows, we have student numbers. And instead of columns, we're going to have quiz numbers. So this is going to be much easier to follow inside your for loops. Now, you can see that we are starting with 0. But my student, I don't have a student 0. My students start with 1. I also don't have quiz 0. I have quiz 1. I personally am used to having index 0. So every time I want to, let's say that my index row is 0, and if I want to say something about the student, then I add 1 to it. But if I want to switch it, I can start with 1 for the loop, but then I have to add an equal sign over here. It's going to be the same number, but my index, instead of going from 0 to less than row code size, is going to go from 1 to equal number of students. So in this case, I have 4. The beginning would go from 0 to 3. The second one goes 0 to 3. The last one is going to go 1 through 4. So if, remember, we need 2 for loop. So a normal one is what? We're going through each rows, in this case, students. So my first loop is going to go through the student numbers. It's going to go from 1 to equal number of students, 1, 2, 3, 4. And remember, this other one is each student. So when I go use the second one, that's going to go to each column. So for a student 1, I have the quizzes, so I can add them together. Now you can see we're going to have a problem for this one. Why? Because I'm starting at 1. I have to deduct 1 from here to get the 0. And that's one of the reasons that I don't usually, to be honest with you, I never start with 1. I always start with 0 and then figure out what I need inside. So we are adding them together. When we're coming out of this inner for loop, that's end of this student. So we're going to calculate the average, and we're going to put it in this array called the student average. We could potentially put it in the next column here, but it's an array. So that's the 2 for loops that we're going to have. Now, for compute quizzes, we are going this way. So we not going through the previous one like we were doing rows by rows. In this case, we are going column by column. We are flipping it. That's why this one start with quiz number, and then inner loop becomes a student number. So we basically flipping our for loops. So instead of going this way, we are going this way. So I want to put this up for kind of thinking about what we have been doing. So a little piece of code to do this. And this is going to be for field array. You already have a function for field array. We want to do it for two-dimensional one. We are asking to ask the user to put all the columns in one line. So you're going to have line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4, line 3. That's it. That's all you're going to. Line 4. If you start with 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, you're asking the user for 5 numbers separated by space. Don't worry about checking it for now. We just want to practice on it. And then we fill up this array.